Instead of using this simple middleware, let's add something more significant like Asp.Net-Mvc. One of the first things I'll need to do is add the package for Asp.Net-Mvc. I could come in here and do a search for MVC. If I scroll around a little bit, I should find Microsoft.aspnet.mvc, and let's just take beta 2. I will save project.json. And over here in the startup file, I now actually have a couple different tasks to take care of. This version of ASP.NET now has dependency injection woven throughout the framework. And when the application starts up, we need to go through a couple different phases. One phase will be the configure phase, where we configure middleware against this application builder object. But before that phase occurs, there will be a phase where we can configure services. Services that will be available throughout the application. And as we'll see later in this module, we will be able to configure services to be injected into other components, much like you would do with an IOC container like Windsor or Structure Map or Ninject. But the configuration of the services takes place before the configuration of the application builder. That way you can have all your services available and ready to go by the time we're ready to configure the application. And to configure the services that are going to be available for this application, I can add a configure services method to my startup class. The runtime will call this automatically, and it will pass in an object that implements the interface iService collection. This is in a namespace that I need to bring in. The Microsoft.framework.dependency injection namespace, I will call this parameter services. And in order to use ASP.NET-MVC correctly, I'm going to need to configure it in as one of the available services. But before I do that, it might be instructive to show you what the middleware configuration looks like and the error that results if the service is not properly configured. So in other words, now that I have a dependency on the ASP.NET-MVC NuGet package, that package will install a new extension method that I can use against iApplicationBuilder, and that extension method is useMVC. If I just want to take all the defaults that the framework provides, this is the only code I need to write to start using MVC. Well, this and the service configuration. But I just want to show you if I try to run the application, we will get a 500 error response from the server. And the underlying error was an invalid operation exception. The runtime was unable to find the required services. And you can see it's being very explicit that I need to walk up to the iService collection and use a method called addMVC to make sure the proper services are in place. So let's do that. I can say services.addMVC. So you add services to the service collection and you use middleware against the application builder. And later in this module, we'll come back and configure some additional services. But for right now, I should be able to save my startup file, and let's go out and create a controller and see if it works. So I will add a folder here where I can place controllers. And inside this folder, let me add a new item. And there will be an item template in here for MVC controller class. I do want something called homecontroller.cs, so let's just add this. And for right now, I don't want to get involved with views and things like that, so let's just return some content, text content, that says hello from a controller. I should just be able to save my files, refresh the browser, and hopefully see this work. And it does. I get hello from a controller. So anytime you've worked with ASP.NET-MVC, you have seen some sort of routing configuration. The routing configuration tells the MVC runtime how to take an incoming HTTP request and map that to a controller. And in our application, we have not configured any routes. When we don't configure any routes, we just get a default routing configuration that is very much like the default routing configuration you would see in previous versions of ASP.NET-MVC. You would explicitly see the code inside of the global.asax startup file somewhere. But our application is not specifying any routes, we're just getting the built-in defaults. But what if I wanted to call this action default instead of index? Well, when I do that and save this file, I will now get a different response from the server because ASP.NET-MVC looked at this request, couldn't find a controller and action to respond to the request, so it just let the request flow through, and eventually IIS Express came back and said, no, we're not allowed to list the contents of this directory. You're trying to get to the root of the site. There's no default page. There's nothing to handle that request. It's just going to return an error. So what if I wanted to change some of the routing rules to make sure that I called this default action? There's a couple different ways to do that. One approach is that when I say that I want to use MVC, there's an overload of this that will take a func So I'll use a lambda expression here, where the func takes a parameter iRouteBuilder, and I can use that route builder to configure as many routes as I want. So this is actually routes, I should call this. I want to use routes.mapRoute. Now mapRoute is actually an extension method, but one of the nice features in C# version 6 and Visual Studio 2015 is that the tools can actually go out and find extension methods that I might be missing. So it's telling me if you just include this namespace, microsoft.aspnet.routing, then you'll actually be able to map a route. And the routing really hasn't changed from the previous versions of ASP.NET-MVC. I can specify the name of this route, I'll call it the default route, and then I can specify a template like controller/action. But one thing that is new in this version of MVC is that if I want to provide default values for the controller and the action, because those sections of the URL don't exist, I no longer have to pass in this crazy anonymously typed object that has controller and action properties. Instead, I can specify the defaults right here in the URL template by just saying controller, the default controller equals home, the default action equals, let's call it default. And once I have the proper number of parentheses here, I can save this file, come back to my browser and refresh. And there I have effectively changed the default routing rules that we use with ASP.NET MVC, and my default controller action is now named default. And of course, I could still get to that explicitly. I can go to /home, that resolves to the same controller and action, or /home/default also works. So this is one way to configure routes. I'm going to leave this code here, but comment the code out. And I'm going to go back to using just app.useMVC. I want to show you another way to modify the routing for an application, and that is by using attributes. Now, attribute routing was actually introduced with ASP.NET MVC 5, but there are some new features that has been refined a little bit. With attribute routing, I could come in and I could say, I want a route home to map to this controller. But one of the new features that is introduced in this version of ASP.NET MVC is that I can also specify controller in square brackets. And now the runtime knows that this should be home/home. If I ever change the name of the controller, if I called it greeting controller, then this route definition would effectively be /greeting. And down here on my default action, I can also provide a route. And I could say this needs to respond to the name of this method, default. So save this file, come out and refresh the browser. This will still be working when I go to /home/default. That's good. What happens if I just go to /? Well, now I don't have a default routing rule that says go to the home controller by default. What I could do is add an additional route here that says, please respond to a request to the root of the website. And I could add a route here that would effectively make this action optional, and save this file again and refresh. And now a request to the root of the website will execute my home controller's default action. So as you can see, many similar concepts carrying over from the previous version of ASP.NET MVC. We still have routing, we still have controllers, we still have a base controller class, we still have action results. And what I want to show you next is that we still have Razor views.